This episode's sponsored by CuriosityStream. Hello and welcome, history buffs. My name is Nick Hodges, and this review will be about one of the last epic voyages of discovery and the horrors that awaited its crew. Based on the book The Terror by Dan Simmons, this is the true story of a British Arctic expedition that went horribly wrong. By the early 19th century, most of the world's oceans had already been explored and charted, but there were a few blank spots on the map that still remained a mystery. One was prized amongst all others: the fabled Northwest Passage. For over 400 years, explorers had searched for a shortcut to Asia, and they believe it existed in Canadian Arctic waters, hidden somewhere in a labyrinth of ice packs and icebergs that continuously shift with the winds and currents. It was believed to be impossible to find a way through. That was until the British Royal Navy believed they finally had the answer. In 1845, they launched two of the most technologically advanced ships of the day, HMS Erebus and HMS Terror. But despite their preparations, these two ships disappeared off the face of the earth. And it is in this horror mini-series that we find out why. However, since it is based on a fictional book, there are creative liberties taken, so what I'll be doing in this episode is to present to you the real history behind that terrible voyage, and a few of the show's inaccuracies towards the end, as well as my likes and dislikes with it. This is The Terror. Here is a part of the Arctic at its worst, the long polar night during winter, when the sun doesn't rise at all for weeks. There are no trees or plants to be found, just a barren landscape cloaked in snow and ice. Its surrounding seas are frozen solid, and the wind chill brings the temperature down to -40 and below. These were the conditions that the men of the Franklin expedition were forced to live in for years. It's because of these conditions that the Northwest Passage remained elusive for so long, which is why when the British tried again in 1845, it was the largest and best equipped expedition they had ever sent. The most obvious way we could see this is with the ships themselves. HMS Erebus and HMS Terror, two former bomb vessel class warships. They were very tough and had been originally designed to hold the weight and fire large mortars on their decks. The theory was that their resilience and durability made them ideal for withstanding the enormous pressure from ice. This seemed to be proven when both ships performed well in other polar voyages, thanks to a series of specially built-in modifications. For example, the ships were strengthened with extra planking at the bow and waterline to prevent ice damage. The hold was sealed off into watertight compartments to hinder flooding. And a recent new innovation at the time: a stove connecting to a series of pipes throughout the ships to provide central heating. By the time of the Franklin expedition in 1845, Erebus and Terror were improved on even further. Their bows were fitted with iron sheeting, and they were both installed with enormous steam engines that drove a screw-shaped propeller, meaning that they could harness the power of steam as well as the wind to push their way through the ice. And if the propellers needed fixing, well, they had an answer for that as well.
You're about to surpass us all, son. You're going somewhere no man has ever been, not even a native.
Another recent innovation was the diving suit, and just like we see in the show, they would have been used for jobs like clearing ice from the propellers or repairing parts of the hull. A diver can now go below even in sub-freezing Arctic waters, a feat that would have been impossible just a few decades before. It's clear that the British were very enthusiastic about using the latest inventions. Aside from modifying their ships, the Admiralty also wanted to fix that age-old problem of feeding its men. It just so happened that another new invention had recently arrived on the scene. It was a process called canning, in which food was sealed in airtight containers and could safely be preserved for years. You could pack it full with meat, fruit and vegetables and would be fresh as the day was sealed. And since canned food had worked so well in the past, it was decided that this would make up the bulk of the provisions on the Franklin expedition. Aside from feeding and sheltering the men, thought was also put into their education, their morale, and basically stopping them from getting bored. For example, the officers' mess had a library with more than 2,000 books to read. Costumes were provided so the officers and men could perform in plays. Sports and games would likely have been encouraged as well. All of this would have contributed to the mental health and well-being of the crew, especially for the long, dark winter months ahead. So that takes care of the ships and their basic kit. Now let's take a look at the very man this expedition was named after, Captain Sir John Franklin. At the age of 59, this was going to be his fourth journey into the Arctic, two of which had been in search of the Northwest Passage as well. This third and final one was supposed to be his magnum opus before he retired gracefully. At first glance, he seems like the right man for the job. Franklin had experience in the Arctic, he had a keen interest in science, and was well liked by his crew. He was seen as a kind and romantic leader, with an infectious enthusiasm for exploration. However, his professional reputation wasn't quite so flattering. In 1819, Franklin led a poorly planned expedition in northern Canada that nearly ended in disaster and resulted in the deaths of 11 men. He and the rest were only able to survive on a broth of rotting deerskins, bones, and rock lichen, and eating scraps of leather from their clothes. It was because of this experience that Franklin became known as the man who ate his own shoes. It was kind of seen as a joke when Franklin returned to Great Britain, one that deeply embarrassed him. He also had a habit of rushing into dangerous situations without thinking first, and not minding his surroundings or equipment. Despite his best intentions, it seems almost preordained that the expedition was doomed to fail. The very name of Franklin's flagship, Erebus, is from Greek mythology, representing the darkness to the entrance of hell.
We are amply provisioned for 3 years and up to 5 with strict rationing.
Your rescue plan. What is your rescue plan? There'll be nothing. You hear? Nothing lives there. Nothing grows. Death is slow in the great white nothing, and 134 starved men will turn devil against you, starting with the ones you hold closest.
Erebus and Terror sailed from England in May 1845 and crossed the Atlantic Ocean. After a month at sea, they arrived in Greenland to take on additional supplies. This would be their last experience of civilization before they ventured out into the unknown. As the ships resupplied, 5 men were sent home for medical reasons, as well as an assortment of letters from the crew. In them, they described their morale amongst themselves was high and fairly confident in the success of the mission. The letters also stated that by the time Erebus and Terror left Greenland, the officers had already begun their scientific testing. They were tasked with observing and recording atmospheric and terrestrial phenomena they were likely to see. The Franklin expedition was heading somewhere that to the average person in Victorian Britain would seem like another world, a place where sometimes the sky has 3 suns instead of 1. Known as sundogs, they are made by ice crystals in the atmosphere that bend sunlight and appear as a halo far off into the horizon, or during the winter months they would have seen the aurora borealis, when the polar night sky lights up from solar winds colliding with the atmosphere. Truly beautiful and spectacular things to witness. But it is also a place where your trustworthy compass can no longer be relied on, as the magnetic North Pole is always shifting. The navigators on Erebus and Terror needed to constantly correct their compass readings to true north if they wanted to stay on course. Today, the feat of navigating away through the Arctic is far less dangerous comparatively, thanks to modern technology.
Satellite info is telling us we're pointing the right way, even though our different magnetic compasses pointing all over different directions. Our gyro compass is somewhere in between.
It's fairly benign as long as everything works just fine, but if we did have to go back to old school magnetic compass stuff, it could get a little exciting.
Unfortunately, the Franklin crew didn't have such luxuries, and they wouldn't have been excited to see what was happening with their compasses. In July 1845, 2 whaling ships spotted Erebus and Terror in Baffin Bay before entering the icy maze to the passage, and then they were gone. When the first year passed without word, there was no alarm. Sir John Franklin was expected to spend at least 1 winter out in the ice, and the ships were stocked for 3 years. But when January 1847 came around and still nothing was heard, that's when people started to get worried. Sir John's wife, Lady Franklin, was the most concerned. She and John's friends knew that Erebus and Terror would run out of food by the summer of 1848, and any chance to rescue them had to be mounted as quickly as possible. Lady Franklin explained as much when she appealed to the Admiralty, but to her frustration, they were hesitant to do much. The official response to her and to the public was they had unlimited confidence in the skills and resources of Sir John Franklin, but that wasn't enough for her.
Our men have been out there in unimaginable temperatures. No one can convince me that optimism or confidence is warm enough.
Fed up and angry, Lady Franklin decided to go over the Admiralty's head by appealing directly to the British public. She turned to every friend and contact she had to raise awareness, including the famous author Charles Dickens. This helped put pressure on the British government, and as winter approached in 1847 with still no word, that's when they decided to act. The first of many rescue missions was sent in 1848 to find Franklin's ships, but it wasn't until August 1850 that they found their first major clue. On a remote corner of Beechey Island, 230 miles west of Baffin Bay, were 3 graves. Scattered alongside them were the remains of a camp, but not much else. It seems that not long after Erebus and Terror entered Lancaster Sound back in 1845, Franklin ordered his ships to take shelter for the winter off the coast of Beechey Island. Once he did, the sea turned to ice and didn't thaw until the next year. We can reasonably determine this is what happened based on the evidence left at the site. For example, if we read the headstones of the 3 men, we get a rough timeline of how long Franklin's crew stayed on Beechey Island. The first 2 men, John Torrington and John Hartnell, were both buried in early January 1846, whereas the 3rd man, William Blaine, was buried later in April. Now, we don't know exactly when the ice melted, just that when it did, the crew were forced to leave rather suddenly. The reason why is because Franklin had been waiting for a path to open through the ice for months, so when it finally did, they had to leave quickly before the ice closed in again. With Beechey Island finally behind them, Erebus and Terror continued with their mission. They sailed south towards King William Land, and it was there where they hoped to find an entrance to the passage. It was at this crucial moment when Franklin had to make a big decision in which direction to take when they arrived.
The exact shape of King William Land is unknown. As we discovered with Cornwallis Land, it could be King William Island, with a chance to sail around its eastern shore.
That is an interesting speculation.
Now, we know today that King William Land is really King William Island, but back then they could only speculate. I don't doubt the possibility was brought up to Franklin, but in the end, he chose to sail west rather than east. What he didn't know was that by taking this route led him to one of the most dangerous waterways in the Arctic. It is a place where every year pack ice from the north is blown south by prevailing winds, creating a choke point impossible to sail through, and it was by King William Island's northern coast where Erebus and Terror became trapped in the ice. No doubt Franklin's crew did everything they could to free their ships, from using giant ice saws or even explosives to blast their way through, all to no avail. For the second time, the expedition became ice-locked and was going to be spending yet another winter in the Arctic. All they could do now was hope for the ice to melt again next summer. Throughout the 1850s, rescue missions searched the vast Canadian Arctic, hoping to find Franklin's crew. But it wasn't until 1859 did they find another major clue. On the northern coast of King William Island, they found a pile of loose stones called a cairn, and hidden inside was a message by the Franklin expedition. Written in May 1847, it said that Erebus and Terror had remained stuck in the ice for the winters of 1846 and 47, that Franklin was commanding and all was well. But scribbled in the outer edges of the message was a second report. Written in April 48, it stated that Franklin had died, 23 of his men had died, the ships were abandoned, and 105 of the survivors would be walking 250 miles south to Bagsfish River, which could take them to the nearest trading post. When news of the message reached home, it shocked Victorian Britain. People couldn't understand how the greatest Arctic expedition met with such disaster, with even its own captain dead. How and why this happened are the questions I'll be answering in this part of my review. On the surface, Franklin's expedition did seem like the best equipped, but when you stand back and look at the whole picture, you'll see why it was doomed from the beginning. Let's break everything down, starting with Erebus and Terror. Like I said before, they were both former warships, but they weren't ideal for where they were going. In fact, their size and strength worked against them. Much of these uncharted waters were shallow, filled with shoals and rocks, not to mention hidden icebergs lurking beneath the surface, waiting to rip out the bottom of their hulls or even smash them on impact. Sailing through the ice here would have been slow, careful work, making their enormous steam engines pointless, which unfortunately weren't even that impressive to begin with. And the reason why is because they weren't maritime engines, they weren't designed for the sea. The enormous steam engines on Erebus and Terror were originally used for trains. They were bought from the London and Greenwich Railway and produced 25 horsepower at the most. This meant that the ship's top speed at full power and sail would only have been 4 knots, woefully inadequate for what they were expected to do. Compare that with this ship, HMS Rattler, which towed Erebus beyond Scotland. It had a much smaller engine, but it produced 220 horsepower, that's 9 knots. So that basically renders the engines on Erebus and Terror as 1-ton paperweights, I'm not even joking. And for an expedition that was supposed to take 2 years, each ship only brought with them 12 days worth of fuel. So any decision to fire up the boilers would only have been made sparingly. In the Admiralty's mind, this is all that was needed for one winter. But no one could have predicted just how cold it was going to be. Normally Arctic ice melts in the summer, but for some reason it didn't for Franklin's crew. Scientists today have been able to analyze ice core samples from the region, and they show that back in the 1840s, the Arctic experienced an intense cold period where the ice refused to melt even in summer. For Franklin's crew, it was almost like they were trapped in an endless winter, one that lasted for 5 years. Freak weather conditions aside, there was something else at work. The high loss of life was staggering for such a well-stocked ship. After 3 years on the ice, what exactly was killing these men? In 1984, scientists hoped to find the answer by exhuming the graves on Beechey Island, and they were shocked to discover that their remains had been remarkably preserved in the ice. Unfortunately, I can't show you what they look like as it might be too graphic for YouTube, but you should really look them up if you're interested. Anyway, the scientists were able to determine that the 3 men had died from tuberculosis and pneumonia. Not exactly out of the ordinary given the time period. But then something else caught their eye during testing. All 3 men had high levels of lead in their bodies, much higher than normal, and the source of the lead matched the solder used to seal the tin cans, which suggests that the canned foods the Franklin crew were eating was giving them lead poisoning. Now, the physical symptoms are bad enough. They include headaches, muscle and abdominal pains, but it also affects the mind, causing confusion, memory loss, mood swings, hallucinations, paranoia, and clouded judgment. If you take all of that and mix it with a group of isolated men in a frozen wilderness, well, it doesn't take much to wonder.
Once it's past all hope, the mind goes unnatural with thought.
What kind of thoughts?
Notions. A darkness.
This kind of darkness. Do you see it among us here?
While this theory does seem to hold weight, it isn't believed to be the main killer behind Franklin's crew, but it may have acted as an accelerant. Another side effect of lead poisoning is that it greatly weakens the body's immune system and makes it vulnerable to other diseases, such as a possible outbreak of tuberculosis. We know that the 3 men on Beechey Islands died from it, and that before them, 5 men were dropped off in Greenland for medical reasons. A more likely culprit, however, would have been something that all sailors feared: scurvy, a disease that wreaks havoc on the body. First, the gums swell up, they turn black and bleed when touched, making eating extremely painful. Bruises start appearing, followed by internal bleeding from the eyes, the nose, even in the muscles and in the joints. For the longest time, the Royal Navy used bottled lemon juice to fight off its symptoms. Unfortunately, lemon juice loses its potency over time, which is one of the reasons why canned food was brought aboard. The fruit and vegetables inside would provide vitamin C when the lemon juice failed. But there was even another issue with the canned food besides from lead poisoning, and that was not all had been properly sealed by the manufacturer. It was discovered later that the Admiralty chose to buy their cans from the lowest bidder, resulting in some of the food to spoil.
I'm concerned about the number of Terror's canned provisions turning up spoilt. I've discovered bad seals, grey meat, and odours that curl my hair. Now, in the event you've already developed a method for handling the problem, I hope you can set aside your envy and share it.
Add salt.
It goes without saying that vitamin C breaks down in improperly sealed cans, but you also have an even bigger problem. Any of the men who ate from the spoiled cans ran the risk of contracting botulism, an illness caused by the toxic bacteria found in rotten food. It causes fatigue, paralysis in the muscles, vomiting, and a high fever, to name a few. And without treatment from an antitoxin, the results can be lethal. So what this tells us is that most of the food the Franklin crew brought with them was either making them sick or even killing them. They probably figured this out and prioritized finding and hunting local game. Unfortunately, their stroke of bad luck didn't even run out there. It would have been difficult to find anything to hunt already, but even if they had, there was another health concern that they wouldn't have known about. That part of the Arctic they were in is endemic with botulism type E. It's the only strain of botulism that can survive in those freezing conditions, and they can be found in marine animals like whales and seals. And if they're not prepared or cooked in a certain way, then you can contract the deadly toxin. It's horrifying to think what these men went through. It's like everything in that place was trying to kill them. The decision to abandon their ships and try to walk it out could only have been made out of desperation. And yet, it was on that fateful walk where their troubles truly began.
Forward, men!
Trekking across that ice wouldn't have been easy for Franklin's men. All that was left of their food and supplies were loaded onto boats on top of sledges, which they pulled by rope. The reason why was because the boats would be needed later to row down Backsfish River, but the physical strain in pulling them would have been tremendous. They would have weighed around 8,000 pounds, which no doubt made them sweat. And in those freezing conditions, that sweat can turn into ice, an exhausting endeavor for even a healthy group. But these men were suffering the effects of scurvy. They would have been in agonizing pain pulling these boats while they were bleeding in the muscles and in the joints, and I can't imagine it would have been easier once they reached King William Island, a landscape made up of limestone, gravel, and sand, and any of the men too sick to pull were likely loaded onto the boats as well, adding even more weight and strain to the others. But it would have been a comfortable experience, as it would have rocked the scurvy-ridden men from side to side. Eventually, the sick who are unable to walk can't even be moved due to the pain. The only thing that could be done with them was to put them up in tents, and it's likely that the rest simply abandoned them as they continued their march south. Now, as to what happened to the other survivors became the subject of much controversy in Victorian Britain, mainly because they came from reported sightings from the local Inuit population, whom the British regarded as unreliable at best. One such account came in 1869 by the American explorer Charles Francis Hall, who spent time with the Inuit. They described meeting a small group of white men on King William Island when they were sealing.
My friends and I, we're looking for game.
Food? Food, yes.
The hunting party gave the starving men some seal meat, but given how many there was no way they could possibly feed them all, especially with their own families to worry about. The harsh reality was that the Inuits felt they had no choice but to leave Franklin's men. Stories like this didn't portray the Inuit in the best possible light, but that didn't matter, because the British already had their minds set by an even earlier account by them. One of the very first, in fact. In 1854, a British explorer called Sir John Rae met with a group of Inuit, who revealed to him the gruesome fate of Franklin's men. They gave him trinkets they found littered across the island as proof of their story that could only have come from the expedition. The natives described a campsite with 30 corpses. Some lay in tents while others scattered outside, and within their cooking pots they found human body parts. In their last desperate hours, these men resorted to cannibalism. When news of the story broke, it caused outrage and condemnation. The Admiralty refused to believe it based on their own experiences in the Arctic, that even on dwindling supplies, the mere thought of eating their fellow man never entered their minds. For the British public, it was a moral issue. These men were heroes when they left English shores. They were the astronauts of their day. To suggest they were capable of doing the unthinkable was quite frankly an insult. John Rae's report was discredited at every turn. The most famous account of this was by Charles Dickens, who was a personal friend of Lady Franklin. In December 1854, he published 3 articles called The Lost Arctic Voyages in his weekly journal, Household Words. They were a collection of short stories of marooned explorers faced with the same decision of whether or not to engage in cannibalism. And at every turn, he shot the idea down as he believed that only the lowest form of people would engage in such barbarism. In one passage, he denounced the testimonies of the Inuit by saying this: "We submit that the memory of the lost Arctic voyages is placed by reason and experience high above the taint of the so easily allowed connection, and outweighs by the weight of the whole universe the chatter of a gross handful of uncivilized people with a domesticity of blood and blubber. This was the most widely accepted belief at the time, and the true story wouldn't be confirmed until nearly 140 years later. In 1993, archaeologists went to one of the campsites described by the Inuits and discovered the skeletal remains of Franklin's crew. Hundreds of bones were analysed and they found evidence of cut marks, specifically at the hands and the feet and of the neck, suggesting that Franklin's men were deliberately removing the most human features of their dead comrades. The only possible comfort from this story is that it could be argued that the Franklin expedition did indeed find the Northwest Passage, as during their desperate march south, they reached the coastline and would have seen the entrance to the passage. At the very least, it's because of their need for rescue why the search party sent after them were able to solve the last piece of the puzzle and place it on the map. In 1866, Parliament unanimously voted to erect a statue of Sir John Franklin in London as a monument to him and to the brave men of his expedition. Below the plaque, it simply says, "They forged the last link." I hope you found the story of the Franklin expedition to be as fascinating as I did. It certainly captured the public imagination for over 170 years, and it's this continued interest that's allowed us to learn more and more about what happened in this tragic piece of Arctic history, even as recently as 2014 and 2016, when the shipwrecks of HMS Erebus and HMS Terror were finally found.
It appears to be in pristine condition. Eerie underwater images show the ship's mast still standing and a trove of historical artifacts inside. The Terror was discovered in the icy waters of Nunavut on the south shore of King William Island in the aptly named Terror Bay.
What are the chances of that? They found HMS Terror in Terror Bay. You can't make this stuff up. Anyway, enough about the historical background. Let's move on to the show itself. The Terror has quickly become one of my favourite miniseries to date, and it's impressive to see how accurate it is, given that it's based on a subject that's so wrapped up in mystery. We don't know for certain what happened to Franklin's men every step of the way, and therein lies the challenge of good historical fiction. If you follow the rules and the clues history has provided, then you have everything you need to tell a really scary story, and you can find them all in the little details. Like, for example, I love how they incorporate Dutch angles into the show. For those of you who are unfamiliar with this term, a Dutch angle is when you tilt a camera on its axis to get a slanted shot. Normally this filmmaking technique is used to convey a sense of uneasiness, that there's something not quite right, and that can build up a lot of tension in a scene. And that completely has the desired effect in the Terror, but what's really cool is that the Dutch angle actually makes sense from a historical perspective. Since Erebus and Terror were stuck in the ice, it's likely that neither ship was completely upright, meaning those men spent years living in a slanted world and knew at any moment the pressure from the pack ice could break in through the hull. Another historical detail I liked was the inclusion of the pets. On the real Franklin expedition, there were 3. There was a cat brought aboard to catch rats, there was a Newfoundland dog called Neptune, and a monkey given to Erebus by Lady Franklin. Now, aside from the cat, both the dog and the monkey are cleverly written to the show for more than just background scenery. For example, we learn about the Royal Navy's social hierarchy when the dog is brought up in conversation.
What rank is that dog? You ever wonder that?
He's on decks most nights, so I guess you could call that watch duty.
I don't know. That'd make him AB or Marine. But he can walk the quarter deck, so that makes him a petty officer at least.
This teaches us that depending on rank, you're allowed in certain areas of the ship and not in others, that there was a deliberate distancing between the officers and the crew, so that over-familiarity did not undermine discipline. So what might seem like an innocent conversation does highlight the social tension, with the idea of a dog having a higher status than a man. As for the monkey, well, I liked how it was used to test out the canned food. Now, we don't know if this is the way it happened, but it's reasonable to assume that they figured out the cans were tainted after a few years. And if Dr. Goodsir, the ship's naturalist, had his suspicions, then he might have come up with an idea like this. I also loved seeing them use a daguerreotype camera. At the time, it was a brand new piece of technology that came out as recently as 1839, and the expedition was indeed supplied with one. It might have been Lady Franklin's idea to buy it, since she arranged for a photographer to take pictures of the officers, and if you compared the portraits of Franklin, Crozier and Fitzjames with the ones in the show, then you will see that they're in the exact same poses, which shows just how much of an effort was made in the Terror being as accurate as possible. Now, this doesn't mean that the Terror is perfect. There are a few inaccuracies I can think of, like when Cornelius Hickey is smoking a cigarette in the hold. For one thing, that's against Royal Navy regulations because, guess what, smoking inside a wooden ship is a fire hazard. But even so, he wouldn't be smoking a cigarette anyway because it hadn't been adopted in Britain yet. These British sailors would have smoked tobacco in their clay pipes, and we know this because broken fragments were discovered in King William Island. There's also the bit when Dr. Harry Goodsir is opening a tin with a can opener, but the problem is that they weren't invented until the 1850s. Instead, they would have used something as crude as a hammer and a chisel to cut a hole through the lid. A bigger inaccuracy, though, would be the scene where veteran Arctic explorer Sir John Ross warns Franklin that he's unprepared for his voyage. But the thing is that Ross had been appointed British consul in Stockholm, Sweden since 1839 and wouldn't return until 1846, a year after Franklin had left. But even if he was in England, I'm not sure if Ross would have been hanging out at the Admiralty's headquarters since he had a major falling out with them over his failure to find the Northwest Passage in 1818. Now, these are all minor inaccuracies and they don't really spoil too much for me. But if I had to pick one thing about the Terror I didn't like, then it's this.
What could have done that?
There must be a bear.
The bear did that.
My first thought seeing this was, oh cool, it's a polar bear, because it looks like that famous 1864 painting, Man Proposes, God Disposes, that shows two polar bears ripping a boat apart from the Franklin expedition. So imagine my disappointment when it turned out to be something else.
I do not believe it is an animal we battle.
Not a man, not a bear. Then what?
A man-bear-pig?
What does that look like to you? It's man-bear-pig. I told you it was real. Look again. There! Half man, half bear, and half pig.
Yes, instead of a polar bear, these men are being stalked by a supernatural monster. And I wish that wasn't the case, because this show is so grounded in reality and takes its history so seriously that this thing feels out of place. And before any of you say in the comment section, I'm well aware that there is a monster in the book, I still don't like it. What's wrong with changing it into a polar bear? Polar bears are the largest land carnivores on Earth, and they're one of the only animals that actively hunts humans. And unless they're pregnant, they don't hibernate during winter like other bears. So what more do you need than that? You got a pre-packaged monster living in the Arctic, and the best part is that they're real. Okay, maybe calling them monsters is a bit harsh, but the more I've learned about these animals, the more I'm convinced that they should have been used. There's this great documentary I watched about polar bears called Survival in the Ice Kingdom, and it covers everything you'd want to know about them. You could find this documentary and thousands like it on CuriosityStream. It's a subscription streaming service that has nothing but documentaries, including history, and you can watch them all for just $2.99 a month. But the best part is that fans of history buffs can get their first 30 days for free. To sign up, all you have to do is enter the promo code curiositystream.com/historybuffs. Anyway, back to the review. Despite my objections with the monster, I still think the Terror is brilliant. They've somehow been able to take real history and adapt it perfectly into the horror genre. Don't expect any cheap jump scares here. The scariest parts aren't even about the monster, but in the environment itself. This show does a remarkable job of building up dread as each episode continues to get worse and worse, and you see each man wither away and eventually become shadows of their former selves, like ghosts in the tundra.
As a trusted friend once put it, this place wants us dead.
And best of all, it's clear that the creators respected the history they were trying to tell and made an effort to follow it as best they could. I definitely recommend giving this a watch. Well, that about wraps it up. My name is Nick Hodges, and thanks for watching History Buffs. And remember, if you like the show, help the channel grow. If you wish to support History Buffs, then you can now do so at Patreon. And as always, let me know in the comment section what you thought about the Terror. And of course, what historical movie should I review next? In the meantime, check out the History Buffs Twitter and Facebook pages for new updates. Until then, I'll see you next time.